The sound was a metronome I hadn't asked for. Click against teeth. Pause. Click against lip. Paisley held her pen like a weapon she hadn't decided to use yet, the black resin tapping a rhythm that dismantled my focus with surgical precision. We were sitting in a glass box suspended 40 floors above the city, supposedly negotiating the distribution rights for the year's biggest indie film slate. But while my mouth was moving, articulating points about gross receipts and back-end points, my mind had completely abandoned the spreadsheet. It was entirely, humiliatingly consumed by the way the leather of her chair groaned, soft, expensive, and heavy, every time she shifted her weight.
Paisley wasn't just an agent. She was an architect of beautiful, profitable chaos.
In this industry, people usually fall into two categories: the sharks who smell blood and the dolphins who perform for treats. Paisley was neither. She was the ocean itself, unpredictable, deep, and capable of pulling you under without you even realizing you were drowning. She represented a roster of talent that was fiercely loyal to her, mostly because she didn't treat them like assets. She treated them like family. That cultural thread ran through her negotiation style. She wasn't just fighting for a percentage. She was fighting for her community. It made her formidable. It made her dangerous. And then there was me. I lived in the lines between the text. My world was built on absolute precision, a structure where A leads to B, and contracts are the physics that keep the universe from collapsing. I needed the margins to align. I needed the clauses to be symmetrical. Some people called it being detail-oriented. I knew it was the only way my brain could quiet the noise of the world. Order was my oxygen.
The boardroom was designed for people like me.
Chrome, glass, white noise. Sterile. But Paisley brought a warmth into the space that felt like a violation of the building's code. She had thrown her coat over the empty chair next to her, a splash of deep ochre against the gray. And the scent of her, something like sandalwood and sharp citrus, was already warring with the recycled air conditioning. The hum of the HVAC system usually soothed me, a consistent white noise. But tonight it felt like it was syncing with my pulse, urged faster by her proximity. The inciting incident of our long night had been deceptively simple. I had slid the standard 20-page boilerplate agreement across the mahogany table at 4 p.m. It was a fair deal. It was the standard deal. I had drafted it with the kind of meticulous care that usually sent opposing counsel home early. Paisley hadn't even opened it. She just looked at me, that dark gaze unflinching, and slid it right back. She didn't just reject the paper. She rejected the premise of my safety. No, she had said, her voice dropping an octave, vibrating in a way that I felt in my chest. We're not doing standard today. We're rewriting it, line by line.
That was 3 hours ago.
Now, the sun had dipped below the skyline, turning the glass walls into mirrors that reflected my own fraying composure back at me. The dynamic was a stalemate of leverage. She held the talent, the directors, the writers, the voices the market was starving for. I held the distribution network, the screens, the platforms, the audience. Neither of us could move without the other, but neither of us was willing to yield an inch of ground.
The room had cleared out incrementally. First, the junior associates, looking relieved to escape the tension. Then the assistants, checking their watches and offering apologetic nods. Finally, the cleaning crew had come and gone, leaving us in a silence that felt heavy, charged. The overhead lights had dimmed automatically to an energy-saving twilight, casting long shadows across the table. It was just us now. The buffer of professional witnesses was gone. The real negotiation was beginning, and the atmosphere thickened, heavy with what we weren't saying. I looked at the stack of red-lined papers between us. My sanctuary of order was being dismantled, ink stain by ink stain, by a woman who looked at a contract and saw a suggestion rather than a rule. I watched her hand move to the page, bracing myself for the next disruption. "You're not listening to the royalty structure," Paisley said, her voice dropping that dangerous octave again. "This sliding scale is insulting." She wasn't just speaking, she was moving. She leaned forward, her elbows planting firmly on the mahogany table, effectively shrinking the world down to the 2 feet of space between our faces. And then the sound. Creak. The leather of her chair groaned under the shift in weight. It was a low, friction-heavy sound, distinct and textured in the quiet room. To anyone else, it was just furniture. To me, it was a sensory spike that traveled straight down my spine. It sounded like weight. It sounded like heat. My heart rate kicked up a notch, a traitorous, erratic rhythm thudding against my ribs. I tried to ground myself by focusing on the contract's font. Times New Roman, size 12, safe, predictable. But the auditory memory of that leather shifting kept replaying on a loop. I needed to regain control. I needed to be the vice president of distribution, not the woman wondering how warm the skin of her wrist was. I straightened my spine, engaging my core, and deployed the look. It was a practiced expression of bored indifference, designed to make agents feel small and unreasonable. "The scale is standard for a release of this size, Paisley," I said, my voice crisp, devoid of the turbulence churning in my gut. "If you want higher points, you need to bring us a franchise, not an indie drama. We're taking all the risk here." It was a solid maneuver. It usually worked. But Paisley didn't flinch. She didn't check her notes or look at her phone. She just smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a challenge. It was the expression of someone who sees the wall you've built and knows exactly which brick to pull to bring it all down. "Risk," she repeated softly, testing the word. "You think you can calculate risk in a spreadsheet? You think because you have the distribution channels, you hold the power? I hold the story. Without the story, your channels are just empty pipes." The air in the room thickened, charged with a sudden, suffocating density. The professional distance I relied on, the desk, the titles, the paperwork, felt like it was evaporating. She wasn't just negotiating a deal anymore. She was negotiating me. She shifted again, another creak of leather, another spike of adrenaline, and she rested her chin in her hand, studying me. "You're sweating," she noted, not unkindly, but with a precision that felt like a caress. "Is it the heat, or is the contract finally getting to you?" "It's the lighting," I lied, my voice tight. "It's inefficient." I looked down, desperate to break eye contact, but my eyes landed on her hand. Her fingers were long, unadorned save for a simple silver band, resting on the red-lined page. The visual anchor was just as distracting as the auditory one, pulling my focus away from the sliding scale and toward the warmth of her skin. The silence in the room wasn't actually silent. It was textured, filled with the rhythmic, maddening percussion of that pen. Tap, tap, tap. Paisley had resumed her posture, leaning back now, the document forgotten for a moment as she considered my last, desperate defense of the distribution timeline. But she wasn't looking at the timeline. She was looking at me, and the pen was resting against her lower lip. The black resin pressed into the soft, pink flesh, creating a small indentation that vanished the moment she pulled it away, only to return a second later. It was hypnotic. It was a pendulum swinging, and I was the fool watching it. I tried to force my eyes to the Clause 14 header, to the safety of the font, but my gaze was tethered to the movement. She held the instrument loosely, twirling it with a dexterity that shouldn't have been alluring, yet somehow made my mouth go dry. It was a weapon of distraction, deployed with plausible deniability, dismantling my focus one beat at a time. My brain, desperate for a foothold in the sliding sand of my own concentration, started counting. It is what I do. When the world gets too loud, too bright, or too chaotic, I count. 1 tap. She is thinking about the gross versus net definition. 2 taps. She knows I am bluffing about the foreign territory cap. 3 taps. Why are her lips so perfectly defined? I forced the numbers to be a shield. If I could quantify the distraction, I could neutralize it. That is the rule of my existence. Identify the variable, isolate it, solve for X. But the variable here wasn't a number I could crunch. It was the wet slick of her mouth, the deliberate slowness of her hand, the way her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, as if she knew exactly what loop she had trapped me in. I was counting to 10, over and over, but I never made it past 4 without my breath catching in my throat. The rhythm wasn't soothing.
It was a countdown to a detonation I couldn't predict. Subsection B is unacceptable, she said finally, breaking the trance. She didn't shout. She didn't even sound angry. She sounded amused, a low hum that vibrated in the quiet room. She reached for the red pen, the one I had been using to bleed all over her requests, and turned the document around to face me. Look at the indemnity language. You've carved out so many exceptions, the clause is basically hollow. She slid the paper across the polished mahogany. It was a simple motion. Physics, friction, velocity. I reached out to stop the slide, to pin the paper down so I could defend my hollow claws with the ferocity of a cornered animal. My hand moved to intercept the page. Her hand was still there, guiding it. It was a collision of trajectories that shouldn't have mattered, but when the side of my index finger brushed against her knuckle, the world didn't just stop, it inverted. It wasn't a spark. A spark implies something small, fleeting, manageable. This was a current. A jolt of absolute, unadulterated voltage that shot up my arm and scrambled the carefully organized filing cabinets of my mind. The texture of her skin was shocking. Warm, solid, real, against the cool, conditioned air of the boardroom. I snatched my hand back as if I'd touched a live wire, my fingers curling into a fist in my lap to hide the tremor, trying to hold on to the ghost of the sensation. My heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs, loud enough that I was certain she could hear it echoing off the glass walls. I needed to speak. Silence was an admission of guilt. Silence was a confession. I looked down at the paper, the words swimming before my eyes, the black text detaching from the white page. The indemnification, I started, but the word fractured in my mouth. I, who prided myself on articulation, on the weaponization of vocabulary, couldn't get the syllables to align. The clause is, it's standard for, I trailed off. I had forgotten the end of the sentence. I had forgotten the argument. I had forgotten why we were even fighting about indemnity, when the only thing that mattered was the heat radiating from her hand, still resting on the paper, inches from where mine had been. Paisley didn't speak immediately. She didn't jump on my weakness or exploit the stutter to push for a better term. Instead, the tapping stopped, the pen lowered. Her gaze, which had been focused on the legal text, lifted slowly, deliberately, until it locked onto mine. It wasn't the look of a shark smelling blood. It was the look of someone realizing there was blood in the water and wondering whose it was. She tilted her head slightly, studying me with a terrifying mixture of curiosity and recognition. She saw the flush rising on my neck. She saw the way my hand was clenched under the table. The dynamic shifted then, moving from the sterile cold of negotiation to something humid, heavy, and undeniably intimate. She knew. And worse, she didn't look away. We needed a ceasefire. Oxygen had become scarce, consumed by the sheer voltage of that accidental touch. I muttered something about needing water, a transparent excuse given the full carafe sitting untouched on the sideboard. But Paisley nodded, her expression unreadable. She stood up and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, putting the length of the boardroom table between us. I remained in my chair, my hands gripping the armrests, trying to recalibrate my internal gyroscope. The silence of the empty office building pressed in against the glass. Usually, at this hour, the building hummed with the phantom energy of cleaning crews or the distant whine of elevators. But tonight, it was absolute. It was a vacuum, amplifying the sound of my own breathing and the rustle of silk as Paisley crossed her arms, looking out at the sprawling grid of city lights below. Her phone buzzed against the glass table surface where she'd left it, a long, sustained vibration that sounded like an angry insect. She hesitated, checking the screen, and I saw her posture shift. The rigid, predatory grace of the killer agent vanished, replaced instantly by something softer, heavier. She picked it up, sliding her thumb across the screen, and turned her back to me, pressing the device to her ear. "Dime," she said. "Tell me." She switched languages seamlessly, slipping into a rapid, melodic Spanish that flowed like water over stones. I don't speak the language fluently. My brain prefers the rigid syntax of coding languages or legal Latin. But I understand the cadence of care. I understand the tone of a woman who is holding a family together from 40 floors up and 3 tax brackets away. I found myself arranging my highlighters by gradient, yellow, orange, pink, just to give my hands a task. But my attention was entirely fixed on the rise and fall of her voice. It wasn't the voice she used with me. The sharp edges were gone. The octave of danger was replaced by a soothing, rhythmic murmur. She laughed once, a low, tired sound that didn't have any strategy behind it. It was just relief. I watched her reflection in the darkened glass. Stripped of the negotiation, she looked exhausted. The tension that held her spine straight seemed to unravel, her shoulders slumping slightly under the weight of a blazer that suddenly looked too big. I realized then that the Paisley sitting across from me for the last 4 hours was a construct. It was a suit of armor she welded together every morning to survive in rooms like this, rooms designed to make people like her feel unwelcome. I knew that armor. I had my own version, made of precision, silence, and impeccable contracts. Seeing the cracks in hers felt like an intrusion, but also like a permission. She ended the call with a soft, "te quiero," and the room fell silent again. She didn't turn around immediately. She stood there, forehead resting against the cool glass, breathing in the view. When she finally turned, she caught me watching. I didn't look away. I didn't pretend to be reading Clause 19. I just held her gaze, letting her see that I had seen her. "Everything okay?" I asked. The question felt inadequate, small. "My sister," she said, walking slowly back toward the table, but not sitting down. She leaned against the edge of the mahogany, crossing her ankles. "She thinks a crisis is running out of vanilla extract for the bakery." She rubbed her temples, her fingers digging into the skin, as if trying to massage away a headache that had been building since noon. Sometimes I envy that. Her problems are solvable. I can buy her vanilla. I can't buy what we're doing here. "You're good at this, you know," I said, the admission slipping out before I could vet it for tactical disadvantage. "The armor. You wear it well." Paisley looked at me, really looked at me, her eyes dark and unshielded. "We have to, don't we? Women like us. In rooms like this." She gestured vaguely at the chrome and leather expanse surrounding us. "If I show up as myself, loud, emotional, family first, they eat me alive. If you show up as yourself, quiet, particular, sensitive, they steamroll you. So we play the parts. The shark and the machine." "I'm not a machine," I said quietly, though I knew the accusation had merit. "I know," she replied, her voice dropping to a whisper that bridged the distance between us better than a shout. "Machines don't stutter when they touch a live wire." The air in the room shifted. The professional antagonism that had fueled the last 4 hours evaporated, leaving something rawer in its wake. We weren't rivals anymore. We were 2 exhausted women, trapped in a high-rise, acknowledging the weight of the masks we were forced to wear. The contract lay on the table between us, a pile of paper and ink, but it suddenly felt like the least important thing in the room. A shared understanding had formed, a hairline fracture in the professional distance that was rapidly becoming a canyon. She pushed off the edge of the table and took a step toward me. Not toward her chair, toward me. The geography of a boardroom table is usually a fixed map of hostilities. There is the North Pole, where the CEO sits. There are the East and West hemispheres, reserved for opposing counsel and their respective armies. And then there is the scorched earth in the middle, where the documents live. For 4 hours, Paisley had occupied the West, a safe, adversarial distance across the mahogany expanse. That was the rule. That was the geometry of conflict. But Paisley, I was learning, didn't care about geometry. "I can't read the red lines from over there," she said, her voice casual, dismantling the borders we had established. "And my eyes are too tired for the printout." She didn't wait for permission. She didn't ask if I minded. She simply walked around the perimeter of the table, her heels sinking silently into the plush carpet, and pulled out the Herman Miller Aeron chair directly to my right. The sound of the wheels rolling over the floor was a low rumble, a drum roll announcing the invasion. She sat down. The air pressure in my immediate vicinity dropped, replaced instantly by a radiant, tangible heat. The proximity was sudden and absolute.
In the vast, empty ecosystem of the conference room, she had chosen to orbit me. The distance between our shoulders could be measured in inches, 3, maybe 4. It was close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her arm, a physical presence that seemed to vibrate against the sleeve of my silk blouse. I stared at the laptop screen, my eyes fixed on the blinking cursor, but my peripheral vision was flooded with her. The ochre of her blazer, the stray curl of dark hair touching her collarbone, the way her chest rose and fell with a slow, deliberate rhythm. "Scroll down," she murmured. Her voice wasn't projected across the room anymore. It was right there, intimate and low, vibrating against my ear. To the creative control clause, section 22. I tried to obey. My hand found the trackpad, but my fine motor skills were misfiring. The cursor skittered across the screen, highlighting a paragraph about force majeure by mistake. I corrected it, my movements jerky, uncoordinated. I could feel her watching my hand, not the screen. The scrutiny felt physical, like a touch. "Here," I said, my voice sounding thin, foreign to my own ears. Section 22, Final Cut Authority. "We need mutual approval," she said. "My director won't sign without it." "The studio never grants mutual approval for a first-time director, Paisley. You know that." The words came out on autopilot, a script I had memorized years ago. "It's a distribution risk. If he delivers a 3-hour cut that's unwatchable, we need the right to trim it." "He won't deliver a 3-hour cut," she countered. She shifted in her seat, and the sound tore through my composure. Creak. The leather groaned, a long, friction-heavy sound that signaled a shift in gravity. She wasn't just adjusting her posture, she was turning. I risked a glance. She had rotated the chair. She was no longer facing the table or the screen. She was facing me. Her knees were angled toward mine, encroaching on the space under the table. If I moved my leg an inch to the right, we would collide. The realization froze me. I was trapped between the armrest of my chair and the heat of her body, pinned by a proximity that felt suffocating in the most intoxicating way possible. "He's an artist," she continued, but the bite was gone from her tone. The argument had lost its teeth. "He needs to know his vision is safe. With you. Specifically with you." "With the agency," I corrected, staring resolutely at the pixels on the screen. "I am just the representative." "Are you?" she asked. "Because you're the one reviewing the edits. You're the one with the red pen. I'm not trusting the agency. I'm trusting the woman who organizes her highlighters by color gradient." The specific observation, the fact that she had noticed my compulsive need to organize the stationery, hit me harder than any legal argument could have. It was an acknowledgement of who I was, stripped of the title. I turned my head slowly to look at her. The distance was negligible. I could count the eyelashes on her lower lid. I could see the flecks of gold in her dark irises. "The clause," I whispered, abandoning the pretense of authority. We can add a consultation period, 48 hours. He can give notes." "Make it 72, she negotiated, but her eyes dropped to my mouth. "Done," I breathed. I realized then that we weren't arguing about the movie anymore. We weren't arguing about timeframes or edits. The negotiation had shifted entirely. We were trading sentences just to keep the conversation going, to justify the fact that we were sitting knee to knee in a dark room at 9 p.m. The contract was just the chessboard. We were the only pieces that mattered. I was no longer fighting to win the deal. I was fighting to keep my hands on the keyboard, to keep my breath steady, to keep from leaning across that terrifying electric 3-inch gap and surrendering the argument entirely. The hum of the overhead lights had transformed from a background annoyance into a physical weight pressing against my temples. Usually, I could tune it out, a white noise filter I applied like a layer in Photoshop. But my filters were failing. The proximity of Paisley, the scent of sandalwood, the heat of her thigh inches from mine, it was all consuming my bandwidth. The buzz of the halogen bulb directly above us started to sound less like electricity and more like a drill. I flinched, a small, involuntary spasm in my shoulder, and pressed the heels of my hands against the edge of the table, closing my eyes for a fraction of a second to reset. "What is it?" Paisley asked. Her voice was low, stripped of the negotiation cadence. It wasn't, "What's wrong with the contract?" It was, "What is wrong with you?" I should have lied. I should have said it was a cramp or dehydration or the late hour. But the armor I wore so tightly had been unbuckled by the last hour of intimacy. The light, I confessed, my voice tight and humiliatingly small. The ballast is failing in the fixture above us. It's humming at a frequency that feels like it's scraping the inside of my skull. It happens when I'm overloaded. It was a dangerous admission for a woman who negotiated 8-figure deals. I can't handle the light bulb. I braced myself for the look of confusion, for the polite dismissal, or worse, for her to use it as a sign of weakness in the final stretch. Paisley didn't ask for clarification. She didn't tell me to ignore it. She stood up. The sudden absence of her heat was a cold shock, but she moved with a purpose that wasn't about leaving. She walked to the wall panel near the door. "Better?" she asked, sliding the dimmer down until the room was bathed in a soft amber twilight, illuminated mostly by the glow of the city outside and the blue light of the laptop screen. The relief was instant. The drilling sound faded to a bearable murmur. "Yes," I exhaled, the tension draining from my shoulders. "Thank you. You should have said something sooner," she said, returning to her seat. But she didn't just sit. She reached out and moved the stack of papers, the ones with the rough, recycled texture that had been grating on my fingertips all night, to the far side of the table. She cleared the space in front of me, leaving only the smooth, cool glass surface and the laptop. It was a small act, a micro-adjustment of the environment, but it hit me with the force of a revelation. In my world, in this industry, people demanded I adapt to the noise. They told me to toughen up, to filter harder. Paisley had just quieted the noise for me. She hadn't used my sensitivity as leverage. She had treated it as a variable to be solved for my comfort. We weren't rivals anymore. You don't adjust the lighting for your enemy. You don't clear the path for someone you're trying to trip. She sat back down, the wheels of her chair bumping gently against mine. The contact was deliberate this time. She leaned in, her arm brushing against my sleeve, and pointed at a note I had made in the margin. "Hold firm on territory." She tapped the word firm gently. "You didn't, though," she whispered. "You gave me France." "I gave you a limited license for France," I corrected, but my voice lacked all conviction. I was watching her hand. Her wrist was resting on the table, the bone delicate under the skin, pulsing with a steady rhythm. Her fingers were relaxed, loose around the pen. If I moved my hand 2 inches to the left, I would cover hers. The thought was so loud I was sure she could hear it. "Semantics," she teased. The pen traveled up, away from the paper, and pointed vaguely toward the screen. "We're done, aren't we? The red lines are gone, the clauses are balanced, the mutual approval is settled." "Technically," I said. "I just need to generate the clean PDF." "Technically," she echoed. Neither of us moved toward the keyboard. The cursor blinked on the screen, a steady, rhythmic pulse, waiting for a command that wasn't coming. To print the contract was to end the night. To sign the deal was to open the door, turn on the lights, and walk away. And suddenly, the thought of walking away from this, from the dim light, the scent of citrus and sandalwood, the terrifying safety of being understood, felt like a loss I couldn't afford. The moment stretched, filled with the hum of the city below and the electric charge of the space between our hands. She was waiting. The document sat there, glowing with the artificial blue luminescence of the LCD screen. It was a digital tombstone for the argument we had just buried. Logic dictated that I press send. Logic dictated I check the timestamp, log the billable hours, and call a car. But my hand remained frozen on the mahogany, fingers curled inward, refusing to execute the command. I felt the desperate, clawing need to pull the conversation back to the only ground where I knew the topography. I needed a timeline. I needed a deliverable. I needed to know where the edges were. "The release schedule," I said, the words sounding brittle in the humid, charged air between us. "If we sign tonight, I can have the marketing deck to your team by Monday morning, but I need the asset list delivered by noon, or the critical path slips. We can't afford a slip." "Stop," Paisley said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The single syllable acted like a physical wall, arresting my sentence in midair. She turned her chair fully now, abandoning the pretense of the table entirely. Her knees brushed mine, a deliberate collision of fabric and bone that sent a fresh wave of static through my nervous system. She wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking at the panic fluttering in my throat. The deal is done. The assets will be there. Why are you still negotiating the schedule? Because that's the process, I insisted, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Process ensures results. If we don't have a schedule, we have chaos. Is that what you think this is? She gestured to the space between us, to the dim room, to the way the air seemed to curve around our bodies. Chaos? It's unstructured, I whispered. It's variables I can't account for. Paisley leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. It was a devastating angle. You treat your life like a term sheet, don't you? Everything has a clause. Everything has an exit strategy. You think if you organize the pens by color, the world won't hurt you. If you categorize the feelings, you don't have to feel them. I wanted to recoil. I wanted to pull up my spreadsheet and hide behind the rows of data. It was one thing for her to notice the lights or the handwriting. It was another for her to dismantle the entire architecture of my survival. She was reading the source code of my personality, pointing out the glitches I spent exhausted years trying to patch. I felt stripped. The sensation was visceral, as if she had reached across the distance and unbuttoned my silk blouse, exposing the frantic pulse at my sternum. It works, I defended, though the defense was weak, crumbling under the weight of her gaze. It keeps things safe. It keeps me functional. It keeps things sterile, she countered gently. It keeps the world behind glass. You're so busy building the container, you never taste the water. Her gaze traveled over my face, mapping the tension in my jaw, the flush on my neck. You're terrified right now, not because the deal is bad, but because you don't know what happens next. There's no clause for this. She was right. I was terrified. But beneath the terror was a dark, heavy current of arousal. To be seen this clearly, to have someone look past the vice president title, past the sharp blazer, past the meticulously organized defenses, and see the frightened, yearning creature underneath, was the most intimate thing I had ever experienced. I was so used to being the person who managed the details, who held the frame for everyone else. No one ever looked at the frame. No one ever asked if the structure was tired of holding up the painting. What happens next? I asked. The question was a surrender. I was handing her the pen. I was letting her draft the terms. Paisley didn't answer with words. She reached out, her hand moving slowly, telegraphing the intent so I wouldn't flinch. She didn't touch me. She reached past my arm, her scent enveloping me. Sandalwood, citrus, heat. And her fingers found the edge of my laptop screen. We stop working, she said. With a soft, deliberate motion, she pushed the lid down. The blue light was extinguished. The glowing contract, the safety of the font, the predictable cursor, all of it vanished. We were left in the amber twilight of the city and the shadows of the room. The barrier was gone. The distraction was gone. There was nothing left to organize. There was only the sound of our breathing, and the woman who had just shut down my world so she could finally really look at me. The sensory details didn't fade with the closing of the laptop. They amplified. Without the blue light of the screen to anchor my visual field, the room became a landscape of shadows and scent. The sandalwood was no longer just a perfume she wore. It was the atmosphere I was breathing. It was heavy, complex, and intoxicating, filling the vacuum where my spreadsheets used to be. The hum of the city outside the glass felt miles away, irrelevant static against the immediate, high-fidelity input of her presence. Paisley held the pen, the black resin scepter that had orchestrated the rhythm of my anxiety for hours. She lifted it one last time, the movement slow and deliberate, catching the faint amber light from the hallway. She didn't tap it against her lip. She didn't use it to point at a flaw in my logic. She set it down on the mahogany table with a single, definitive click. It wasn't just a sound. It was punctuation. It was the period at the end of a sentence I hadn't realized we were writing. The business was done. The negotiation was closed. And with the tool of her trade abandoned on the table,
The last barrier between us dissolved. She moved. It wasn't the aggressive forward lean of a negotiator seeking leverage. It was a fluid, confident encroachment into my personal space. She reached out, her hand bypassing the empty space where the contract had been. I flinched, a microscopic reaction, my muscles tensing in anticipation of a handshake or a gesture to the door. I expected a dismissal. Instead, her fingers brushed the shell of my ear. The sensation was electric, a shock of warmth that had no business existing in a room this cold. She caught a loose strand of hair, one that had escaped my severe structural bun hours ago, and tucked it gently behind my ear. Her hand didn't retreat. Her knuckles grazed the sensitive skin of my jawline, and then her palm settled there, cupping my face with a possessive, terrifying tenderness. My internal monologue, usually a relentless ticker tape of risk assessments, verbal proofs, and to-do lists, simply flatlined. There was no data. There was no projection. The algorithm that ran my life crashed under the sheer weight of the input. I couldn't categorize the texture of her thumb moving against my cheekbone. I couldn't quantify the heat radiating from her wrist. The silence in my head was absolute, a sudden, ringing void where the logic used to be. I was no longer the vice president of distribution. I was just a body, reacting to the gravity of another body. I started to speak, but the syllable fractured. My voice was breathless, stripped of all its usual cadence and authority. I tried to find the thread of the argument, to pull up the mental file on professional boundaries, but the file was corrupted. I don't recall the last term. It was a confession of total incompetence. In my world, you never admit you lost the thread. You never admit the data is gone. But I couldn't lie. Not with her eyes searching mine, dark and unyielding, seeing right through the executive dysfunction to the woman trembling underneath. I lost track, I whispered, the admission terrifyingly liberating. I lost the deal hours ago. I've just been counting the taps. Paisley smiled. It wasn't the shark smile. It wasn't the polished grin of an agent closing a sale. It was soft, a little sad, and deeply satisfied. Her thumb stilled on my cheek, grounding me in the chaos. I know, she murmured. Her voice was a low rumble that I felt in my own chest. Why do you think I kept objecting to the font size? The realization hit me slower than the touch, wading through the fog of my arousal. The font size? And the indemnity. And the force majeure. She leaned closer, her forehead almost touching mine, her breath ghosting over my lips. I accepted the deal at 5 p.m., darling. The contract was fine. The terms were generous. I would have signed the boilerplate. My brain tried to reboot, sputtering sparks. But we argued. For 4 hours. You threatened to walk over the royalty ladder. I fought, she corrected gently. Because if I signed the paper at 5 p.m., you would have shaken my hand, picked up your briefcase, and walked out that door. You would have gone back to your perfect, silent apartment and organized your spice rack by origin. She wasn't wrong. That was exactly the Tuesday night I had planned. I wanted to keep you here, she admitted, her gaze dropping to my mouth. I wanted to see what happened when the machine ran out of fuel. I wanted to see you unspool. You stalled, I breathed. The logic was returning, but it was serving a different master now. It wasn't serving the company. It was mapping the desire in her eyes. You manufactured a crisis. I created an opportunity, she countered. Her hand slid down from my jaw to my neck, her thumb resting on the pulse point that was fluttering wildly against my skin. And you let me. You're smart. You knew the clauses were nonsense. You could have called legal. You could have left. You stayed. I stayed, I agreed. The truth hung in the air between us. I hadn't stayed for the deal. I had stayed for the friction. I had stayed because for the first time in my life, the chaos she brought felt better than the order I craved. So, she whispered, the distance between us now measured in millimeters. The deal is signed. The work is done. The logic is gone. What are we negotiating now? What are we negotiating now? The question hung in the silence, vibrating with more tension than any contract term we had disputed all night. The answer wasn't something I could draft. It wasn't something I could bullet point. Paisley stood up slowly, the movement fluid and deliberate. It wasn't a retreat. It was an escalation. She rose, and the sudden shift in altitude forced me to tilt my head back, breaking the trance of her touch on my cheek, only to replace it with the overwhelming reality of her standing height. I stood too, my movements less graceful, my legs unsteady as the adrenaline of the argument metabolized into a different, sharper chemical flood. Standing changed the geography of the interaction entirely. When we were seated, the table was a shield, a convenient barrier we could retreat behind when the subtext got too loud. Now, there was nothing. No mahogany, no glass, no legal pads, just two women standing in the dark, the city grid glowing beneath us like a complex electric circuit board that I suddenly had no interest in decoding. The gravity in the room seemed to reverse. Usually, I am anchored by logic, held down by the heavy, comforting weight of expectations and rules. I exist in the safety of the known variables. But here, separated from her by nothing but air and intent, I felt weightless, pulled toward her by a force I couldn't calculate in a spreadsheet. It was a vertigo of the soul, terrifying and absolute. Her hand moved from my neck, sliding down the silk of my blouse with agonizing slowness. It traced the curve of my shoulder, the line of my spine, ignoring the fabric to map the tension underneath, until it settled firmly on the small of my back. It wasn't a tentative touch. It was possessive, grounding. It pulled me in, collapsing the final inch of distance until the fabric of her blazer brushed against my shirt. I could feel the heat of her, a radiator against the cool, recycled air of the office. The contact burned, a sensory anchor that made the rest of the room dissolve into gray noise. "New terms," she whispered, her voice rougher now, stripped of the polished cadence she used for clients. "We leave the papers. We leave the laptops. We leave the vice president and the agent locked in this room until morning." "And who leaves?" I asked, my voice barely a sound, trembling slightly. "Just us," she said. "Just Paisley and you." She said my name like it was a secret she had been keeping all night, a variable she had finally solved. "We go to that quiet place on 4th, the one with the terrible lighting and the excellent wine. And we don't talk about distribution rights. We don't talk about gross receipts." I looked at the table one last time. The red-line pages, the capsized pens, the battleground of the last 4 hours. The black resin pen she had used to dismantle my focus sat there, innocent and still. It all looked like artifacts from a different life, a museum exhibit on how we used to communicate. The precision I worshipped, the structure I craved, it was all still there, waiting for me in the morning. But for tonight, the only structure I cared about was the line of her jaw and the steady, reassuring pressure of her hand on my spine. "That sounds..." I paused, searching for the right word, my brain flipping through the thesaurus of corporate objections and finding nothing that applied. "Inefficient." Paisley laughed, a low, genuine sound that vibrated against my chest. "Terribly inefficient. It's going to be messy and unstructured, and we'll probably stay out too late. Are you in?" "I'm in," I surrendered. And I meant it. I was terrified, unmoored, and completely, wonderfully out of control. The negotiation was over. The merger was beginning. We walked out into the cool night air, the automatic doors sliding shut on the sterile world behind us. The wind hit my flushed skin, a sharp contrast to the heat still radiating from her arm brushing mine. I breathed in, and the city smelled different. No longer just exhaust and rain, but sandalwood and electric promise. If you've ever lost an argument because you wanted to lose to the person making it, subscribe for more stories from the boardroom.